My name is Benny. I work for Red Hat in Israel. And during the week, I build design systems using web components. And if those words are unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to check out my talk from DevConf.CZ. Just look at the URL in the talk for this year and replace 2025 with 2023. Learn all about it over there. So today we're going to talk about some of the new features that have come or are coming to the web platform for web components developers. In other words, these are things that you can now do with your custom elements, or will hopefully soon be able to do with your custom elements, that you couldn't do before, unlocking new use cases and new web adventures. So let's get cooking. So the first one I want to talk about is called element internals. Okay, that's the name of the DOM object that will exist on your element when you create it. And it basically does what it says on the tin. Element internals is sort of like a bag of properties that can apply to an element. And you can add information to those properties. It has certain methods to handle form validation and things like that. And it lets you do all kinds of things with your custom elements that you couldn't do before. It also comes along with another API called form-associated custom elements. That allows you to take a web component and make it act as if it was a native input element, or if it was a button element or something like that. You can have your custom element submit along with the form. Okay? So once you've declared that your element is form-associated, then you can use element internals in order to do stuff with the form, to set a value for the element, to do form validation, to set custom states on your element, that kind of thing. And you can also handle accessibility through the ARIA attributes. ARIA standing for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. You'll notice that element internals is available cross-browser. You can use it today in your elements to add semantic defaults and that kind of thing. So let's learn a little bit more about how that works. So when you create an element internals object on your element, you actually call this method on the element called attach internals. You can only do that once, right? So if you're going to do it, you should do it inside your class and not from outside, so someone else can take over control of your element. Once you do that, you get this element internals object, and it has getters and setters, so you can set things like, you know, this.internals.aria label equals some label that you give your element. Once you do that, those properties will act as the defaults for your element. What do I mean when I say defaults? So let's say you have a nav element, you know, which is like an HTML nav element on the page. Well, if you just put a nav element on your page, assistive technology will register that element as having the navigation role. It has what's called an implicit role in it, okay? And that allows you to do things with that element and allows you to pass information to assistive technologies without having to write a bunch of ARIA attributes and role attributes and things like that. So by way of element internals, you can give your custom elements their own implicit ARIA attributes. And just to make the implicit explicit, when I say that they're implicit ARIA attributes, is that a user can then come in and still put on your element, you know, my element ARIA label equals whatever, and those user-defined ARIA attributes will take precedence over the defaults that you set. That's the idea behind element internals. Now, not all of the APIs on element internals are available across browsers. So if you set something like an ARIA label where it's just a string property, and then the screen reader will get that string and read it out, that's fine. That you can do today. But if you want to do something like ARIA labeled by elements, which we have here, that's actually a reference to a list of DOM nodes. That you can only do in certain browsers at the moment. Not all browsers have implemented that, and it kind of sucks. But you know, hopefully in the future, we'll have that widely available. The major issue with element internals right now is third-party tools, specifically accessibility testing. There's an issue open on the Axe core library on GitHub right now, describing how if I set on my custom element some default semantics, it's an input, it has a label, whatever. Axe core can't necessarily get access to that information. And there are technical limitations why. They've said that because they have to run in a browser extension context, they can't necessarily gain access. Maybe the element internals object is on an ECMAScript private field inside of my class, so they can't just call like .internals. And even if there was some community protocol that said, you know, we all promise to put a map of our elements on this global key that you can check later, they might not even be able to do that because they're running in an extension or something like that. So if you use element internals to add semantics to your elements today, you might get reports on your project which say, hey, our pages are failing Lighthouse accessibility review. What's going on? And then you'll have to explain to them, no, it actually is accessible. Like, we've done manual testing. It works with the screen reader, but AxeCore can't validate that. And so they'll automatically fail you. That's a problem, and hopefully that problem will be fixed soon. If you have an idea how to fix that, go see the GitHub thread. OK, so you would use this to create custom form controls like my input, my button, that kind of thing. And this lets especially library authors like myself, design system authors, ship something like, here's a Red Hat button, or here's like a Fedora checkbox, or whatever it is. Here's a DevConf form, or whatever you have, and have that submit with the form, which is pretty cool. And you can even have them associate with labels. So you can use a label element and say, this is the label for my own custom element, and it'll all just work like you'd expect. It's pretty sweet. OK, the next one on our list is called reference target. Now, this is a pretty big one. So the problem that reference target is trying to solve is called cross-route ARIA. If you're familiar with this problem, like, you're probably feeling like a little bit of a gripe there in the gut region. I know I am. The problem of cross-route ARIA refers to how to make semantic connections between elements when those elements exist in different routes. Let me explain what I mean by that. Say you have a custom element on your page, and that custom element has inside of it an input. And you want to associate inside of its shadow root, OK? And you want to associate that input inside of the shadow root in your custom element with a list box that's in the document, not in the shadow root. How do you do that? Normally, the way that you associate an input with a list box is by ID reference. You'd say, this input ARIA controls that list box, or some other attribute that establishes that relationship. And you would do that by saying ARIA controls equals the ID of my input. That works great if all of those elements are in the same document. But when one of them is in a shadow root, the shadow root encapsulates all of the HTML inside of it. So those IDs don't go out into the document. As far as the document's concerned, there is no ID of input that you can reference. That is essentially the cross-route ARIA problem, right? So this has to do with things like drop-down buttons, or combo boxes, or sometimes you'll have like a tab group where you want to associate the button on the tab, the tabs up at the top, which switch the content in and out. So you want to associate each one of those buttons with their panel. Well, if the button is inside of a shadow root, you're going to have a hard time doing that. So to solve this problem, we have the idea of reference targets. And that looks something like this. Now, this is a proposed feature. It doesn't exist in any browsers today, so you can't use it today. But if you have ideas how to make this feature better, or how it might work better for your projects, you can chime in on the issues. So how does this work? So let's say we have this fancy input. That's our custom element. We are the authors of this element. And we want to make it work with the rest of the document. So up here, there's a label which is referencing the fancy input, right? And what we want is for this label to be associated with actually this input, which is inside the shadow root of our element. Make sense? Right? This template element is saying, create a shadow root. Create a shadow root under fancy element and have it have this input inside. Now, the problem is this real input ID doesn't exist in the document. Right? So when the browser, using whatever lookup it uses to associate elements, when it says, like, hey, I've got a label, and I've got a reference to this thing called fancy input, well, I'll go here, I'll say, well, this doesn't really have any way to associate with a label. We'll just quit. What you really want is for this label to be associated with this input. So when the user's focused on it, it reads out fancy input. Reference targets solve this by introducing a new attribute on shadow roots called shadow root reference target. And what this means here, by adding this attribute to the shadow root, you're saying, hey, anything that comes in from the outside and references my ID, actually forward that reference to this ID inside the shadow root. Right? So in other words, what we're saying is that this fancy input element, for the purposes of accessibility and semantics, forwards down to this input here in the shadow root. An important part of the way this feature works is that it doesn't leak out your internal implementation. The whole idea of having Shadow DOM in the first place is so that I, the custom element author, can muck around inside the shadow root without affecting the rest of the page. Maybe you had that experience back in the day working with jQuery widgets. I know we're not supposed to say that word anymore, right? But like you download some jQuery widget, unzip it, upload it to your FTP server, and put in the little JavaScript script, and great, you're supposed to have now your fancy button on the page. Except the fancy button works now, but somewhere else on the page, everything else is broken. Well, what happened? It's because that jQuery widget has classes and IDs and references inside of it, and everything's global. It's all one big document. Right? So shadow root solves that problem by letting you, the custom element author, do whatever you want, more or less, within reason, inside the shadow root without affecting the rest of the page. But the limitation there is that then you want to make these associations, and it's going to be difficult. So as I said, this is a proposal that is in progress. You can take a look on GitHub and chime in over there. And actually, just this week, Alice Boxall from Igalia published her slides from Web Engines Hackfest, and she talks in more detail about the problems facing this proposal, some of the alternatives that are on the table, and how we might more quickly get this thing over the line. If you care about accessibility and you'd like to see robust, maintainable design systems and web components available to users, I encourage you to check those links out. So until we get this feature, what can we do? Well, one thing that we do on our team is we'll copy a bunch of DOM nodes into the shadow root and visually hide them and then copy their contents in and set up references inside the shadow root. Gross, right? Not great. And it can break, and then it breaks also user expectations because then they'll say, well, we changed the text content over there and it didn't update in the thing. It's a mess. Don't recommend it. There are other workarounds that you can use, but none of them are particularly good. So look forward to reference targets. OK, next one's a pretty big one, but we're going to do it very briefly, because this one's a ways off. It's not going to be shipped anytime soon in browsers, but this is declarative custom elements. The idea that you can use HTML to write HTML. Use HTML to define and implement your custom elements without having to write JavaScript and import ES modules and yada, 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 yada. OK, so the idea here is, if you remember the old Polymer project, the very first web components way back in the day, there was the element, and then there was a template inside there, and you could define your whole thing with sort of a handlebars mustache syntax and set up your attributes and all that. That's where we want to get back to. OK, it's a long ways off, but maybe we will. And this idea of declarative custom elements is really made up of a bunch of smaller proposals that go along with it. So we have things like, we should just underline that this is not available today. They're sort of like trolley fills, potential implementations that use JavaScript to read your attributes and create custom elements. And that's kind of interesting. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of I don't want to use JavaScript right now just to define my card that has a slot, and a slot, and there's no methods and no events, right? But if we ever do get this, it'll make web development more accessible and available to a wider audience. So in order to get this over the line, now this is opinion, this next sentence is opinion here. I'm of the personal opinion that we'll need to break this down into smaller proposals and get each one of those proposals independently approved, which means each part of this idea of declarative custom elements has to have its own independent utility. And I base that opinion on having watched the standards process and see how long it takes to get these things over the line. And the bigger the scope of your proposal is, the less likely it's going to be to go in. But there are proposals in the works for these features. So we have things like CSS module scripts. Already you can import JSON with import attributes into your ES modules. So you'll also very soon, and in Chrome today, be able to import CSS files into your ES modules without a build step, without having to transform them and turn them into JavaScript objects. They'll just import as CSS style sheet objects. Down the line, we might get HTML modules, which is the idea that I can import a piece of HTML. Just this past week, on the Shop Talk podcast, Jake Archibald did a whole episode about HTML includes, and maybe there'll be one day a native way to do HTML includes in HTML, and that might also be a way to piggyback on that. If you're interested in the idea, go check out that podcast. And then a third part of this proposal is called DOM parts. An earlier version was called template instantiation. That's the idea that I can write a sort of template element that has dynamic updatable parts inside of it. Right? So I have my card element, but my card element could have, what's a good example for a card element? My card element could have an image in it, if there's a certain attribute on my host, on the custom element, then it'll have an image. And if there isn't that attribute, it won't have that image. That capability we don't have on the web platform today without using JavaScript. But down the line, there might be some kind of standard template syntax which lets you toggle off, sort of like control flow in HTML, if statements, repeats, that kind of thing. Personally, I'd love to see that. I think it would be super cool. But as I'm sure you might imagine, there's going to be quite some discussion and argument about what's the best way to do that. So go take a look at those issues. OK, here's a fun one. So let's say you want to change some styles on your custom element depending on its content, right? Now, one thing we do on our team and the design system team at Red Hat is we'll have sort of container elements inside of our custom elements. And there we can change a bunch of styles. So we can say, like, the background color will be this or that on the container element in our shadow root, depending on the attributes. That's easy, right? But what if I want to change styles on the host element, depending on what the content is? For that, you have to use JavaScript, right? But you can actually today in some browsers use CSS to do that. And it's really cool. There are two flavors of this feature. One which selects for content that's in the light DOM, HTML children of your custom element, and another one which selects for content in your shadow root, right? So change the background to red if I have h1 inside as one of my children, or change the background to red if there's a certain class name in my shadow root. Okay? How does that look? Well, this is the version host with has in the parens. This is the one that selects for light DOM children. Okay? It lets you say, if I have an h1 child, change the background color of my host, or something like that. The other version, which is selecting after the host selector, says, look into the shadow root, see if that element exists, and then change the host styles. So these are different from another proposal, which is called has slotted, which is saying, if I have an element slotted into this particular slot in my shadow root. A slot element is something you can put in a shadow root to say, like, content goes here. So you'd have like a card element that has a header slot, a body slot, and a footer slot. So you might want to have the footer have a certain padding if there's a button inside. So you could say, hey, footer slot, if you have a button in your slot, have this padding. That would be a cool feature to have, and that's coming as well soon. So I prepared some examples of what this looks like. We have here on the left, that is Safari, I believe. Yeah, on the top right is Chrome, and the bottom right is Firefox. And don't get too bogged down in the code, but basically what this snippet is saying is, if there's a section h1 in my children, as one of the light DOM children of my element, the background should be green. And that today works in Safari, and fails in Chrome and Firefox. This is an example of the other kind, which is saying, look into the shadow root, and if I have over there a section, then make the background green. That one works in Chrome, but not in Safari or Firefox. Web development. All right, they said, like, it'll be fun, they said. OK, but you can look forward to these features coming soon. They are tested in the web platform tests. So the browsers are currently, today, measured against their ability to support this feature, which is pretty cool. Next, we've got scoped custom element registries. So what this solves is the problem that custom element names, like Red Hat card, DevConf button, those tag names are in a global registry that applies everywhere on the page. And if someone else tries to register that same tag name, everything blows up. Your script fails, and JavaScript halts, which is not what you want to have, right? Part of one of the supposed advantages of custom elements is they let teams work independently on encapsulated parts of the page without stepping on each other's toes, as long as they all agree on which tag names are what, right? So scoped custom elements registries lets us assign a whole registry of tag names to just a part of the page. And you can attach one of these registries either to a shadow root or to any element. You could say this div has its own custom element registry. Well, why would I want to do that, right? So let's say we're working on micro front ends. You've got like a big old dashboard, and there's one team in charge of the dashboard app shell, and then there's 50 teams, each one of them working on their own little applet inside the card. And this team needs to use version 1 of your design system because they haven't touched their code base in 5 years. And if one of them even looks at it, their entire office is going to burst into flames. And that team down there, they're really keen. And what they want to do is use version 5 of your design system because they really, 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 really want that new feature. Only problem is both design systems have the same tag names. right? Well, with scoped custom element registries, that team can have their registry, this team can have their registry, and everyone gets along nicely. Another problem that this can solve is the double registration bug. So if you, let's say, import the same custom element with the same code from two separate modules, maybe different query strings, or maybe one is bundled and the other one is not. So it'll blow up even though it's the same code. It should be the same object, but it's a different reference. So the browser will just quit. Now, if you're paying attention, that is sort of a foot gun. You might end up running the same code in two different places. But that's an architecture problem. We can solve that in other ways. This improves the developer experience, especially at large organizations. It makes collaboration much more attainable. It lets teams move at their own pace. We're having multiple teams work on the same document. And that is all I have for you. So I want to say thank you to my colleague in the Web Components community group, Westbrook Johnson, who helped me with some of the references and some of the research for this thing. I also want to encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, reach out to the Web Components community group. There's like a Discord chat. Apologize, I know Discord is kind of cringe, but that's what we have. There's a GitHub organization. You can comment on issues. Check it out, OK? I would love to answer your questions if you have any. Don't be shy. No? No questions? OK. Thank you very much.